Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C., and this is the penultimate broadcast of the old year 2013. It's our Christmas week edition. And remember, the significance of Christmas is an important one, theologically and philosophically. If you compare Christianity to the Nirvana religions, you recall that in the Nirvana religions of the East, the big concern is how to get out of the material universe. And this always implies a certain, what can we say, nonchalance about the fate of those who are going to remain behind in the material universe, whereas, from that point of view, some people would say, God coming into the world was a terrible mistake. You might have seen on cable television a couple of years ago an attempt to rehabilitate Judas Iscariot precisely from this point of view, saying that Judas Iscariot was actually a benefactor because Christ had made this terrible mistake of coming into the world, and then Judas was the guy who helped him get out of the world and correct the mistake, although in the horrible way that was seen then on the hill of Calvary. But the idea then is that if God is willing to come into the world and be a part of the material world, that means the material world is not that bad. At least it's not absolutely evil. It might be improved. It might be perfectible. And that, I think, is the very important philosophical significance of this holiday. It means that the Manichaeans are wrong. It's not the case that there's a world of spirit where things can be good and a world of material where everything is automatically bad. And when I say Manichaeans, this gets us, unfortunately, uncomfortably close to Martin Luther. And now that we're going into 2014, we've got to remember that the 500th anniversary of Luther, at least of nailing the theses to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral, that's Halloween 1517. So we're now approaching the 500th anniversary of Protestantism, and unfortunately the net impact of Protestantism is to move Christianity a bit in the direction of that Manichaean outlook. But fortunately, not all the way, and maybe this influence is less now than it might have been at different times in the past. At any rate, it's better if God is willing to come into the world for the sake, at least, of those of us who are in the material world and happen to or plan to stay here for a little while longer at least. It means that the material universe is not metaphysically, radically evil. It is at least susceptible to something other than total evil. So therefore, this on the whole is a worthwhile holiday, despite all of the distortions. Now let's look in particular at the world of economics and its relation to the doctrine of charity, right? Faith, hope, and charity, these three, and the greatest is charity. And we can say, when you're talking about the general welfare, you're talking about something that looks very, very much like charity. When you're talking about charity, you're talking about something that looks very much like Muslim social solidarity. There's a similar doctrine in Judaism, and we have Confucian benevolence. And these are the values that need to be pushed forward at this time of year. And it's always good to remember that old romantic anti-capitalist, Charles Dickens, who has contributed so much to the cultural atmosphere of the holiday. And these works of Dickens, if properly read, they do have a meaning. Remember that Dickens was horrified by the British school of economics, and with good reason. In particular, you'll remember David Ricardo and others, and the profession of many of these British economists, of what was called the iron law of wages, which simply meant that you're in a market situation, liberismo selvaggio, a wild free market, and that in that free market, if the working class got paid more, they would multiply, there would become more of them. That would then, by the law of supply and demand, drive down the rate of wages. That would cause famine and death, and then the cycle would begin anew. When the numbers of the working class had shrunk to a suitable level, then the law of supply and demand would kick in, and the real wages would presumably start to go up again. That's the iron law of wages. That is why the Manchester School of British Classical Economics, with Ricardo, with James Mill, with John Stuart Mill, with a number of others, Jevons later on, that's why this was known as the dismal science. The dismal science, because it taught that there was no way to improve the human condition. In other words, if you do somebody a favor and give them a wage increase, well, then there'll be more workers. That will drive down wages in some future time, and the cycle of genocide will go on. That's the essence of British classical economics. And there never was a good phase. Don't let any Marxist tell you that Ricardo was somehow better than what came after. Absolutely not. He was an absolute sociopath. But that is what Dickens is horrified by. And you can see this in books like Hard Times, where he attacks what he calls the Gradgrind school of economics, right? The Gradgrind is, we want the facts, we want the facts. But out of this grows Malthus. And out of Malthus grows Darwin. And out of Darwin, the biological charlatan, we get the charlatan doctrine of social Darwinism. And that is the famous scene at the beginning of Dickens' Christmas Carol, where the two liberal financiers come in and talk to Scrooge and tell him that they're taking up a collection for the poor. And Scrooge, of course, answers in his famous way, "Are there no prisons? And the union workhouses, are they still in operation? The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor then?" Said Scrooge. Under the poor law, husbands and wives were separated, families were broken apart to prevent the birth of any more children. And once you got into this, it was just about impossible to get out of it. I was afraid from what you had said at first that something had occurred to stop these institutions in their useful course, said Scrooge. But there, of course, these are horrible institutions. And the two gentlemen comment that many can't go there, and many would rather die. Many people would die to keep their families together. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. And that's Malthus. That's Darwin. And that's also Keynes, because Keynes is also acknowledged by himself as being a successor to Malthus. Now, in our time, what do we have? Previous broadcasts, we've covered the growing momentum to raise the minimum wage. And what this means, of course, is that any political economy in any given stage of its development demonstrates a certain distribution. And that distribution is the result of the political forces, of class struggle, and at any time. And the question is, which way will it be altered? And we'll be back in a minute to comment on how it ought to be altered in 2014 here on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. And I wonder when we get to the point where the Wall Street finance oligarchs, the predators, the parasites, throw down their derivatives and say, business, mankind was my business, the common welfare was my business, charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business, and it is this time in the rolling year, I would have said the rolling fiscal year, that this suffering is the most acute for Marley's ghost, chained to those old ledgers and safes and strong boxes. And today, of course, it would be electronic with derivatives, collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps, and other derivative exotic securities. All right. So this is the question of economics. There is no more corrupt discipline than academic economics. And, of course, we've had Helicopter Ben Bernanke, who has perverted the Federal Reserve, right? He's supposed to provide full employment as well as currency price stability. He has totally failed to provide full employment under the Humphrey-Hawkins Act. He's in insurrection against the Humphrey-Hawkins Act, and he should have been impeached before he's leaving. Yellen is presumably on her way in. She seems to be a nonentity, a cipher. She took her policies from Helicopter Ben, and now it looks like she's going to take her policies from this character, Stanley Fischer, who he's got a kind of a nightmare resume of every monstrous point in the world, be it Massachusetts Institute of Technology Economics Department, Oxford. He's worked for Citibank. He has worked for the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. He's a member of the Bilderberg Group, and so forth. He has been the governor of the Bank of Israel. The Central Bank of Israel was his most recent job. And this person, born in Rhodesia under, I guess, racist conditions then, who knows how much he benefited from this, then goes on to have dual citizenship of the United States and Israel. This person in his career seems to personify cosmopolitan, international finance capital, globalized exploitation of this predatory banking universe. And it looks like Yellen, instead of taking her cue from Helicopter Ben, will take it now from Stanley Fischer. And, of course, that's even worse. And everybody is now getting ready for the deca-taper, the tapering of the QE3 support operations. Remember, this was $85 billion minimum per month of rotten, bankrupt derivatives, of collateralized debt obligations, CDOs, CDO squares, super CDOs. That is now slowing, and that may mean big trouble for this asset bubble, which has emerged, certainly, in the stock market. Remember that the hot money recovery doesn't work. The Keynesian consumer-led recovery has some effect, but does not work. The deflationary method espoused by Ron Paul and Rand Paul and the other libertarians following von Hayek and von Mises of making the business cycle worse and driving it down to the very bottom, right? Let it burn out. The infamous liquidate stocks, liquidate bonds, liquidate real estate, liquidate the farmer from the fascist Andrew Mellon doesn't work either. Unfortunately, the hot money doesn't work. So what you're left with is my method, the method of the American system, which is force the central bank to open up a credit stimulus window at least. If you can't transform the whole thing, start by transforming a piece of it. $5 trillion, please. $1 trillion to lower the overall interest rate on student loans to zero, and $4 trillion for the beginnings of an infrastructure program which will eventually create 30 million new productive jobs at the most modern science and technology available at union wages. And anything less than that is a shuck. Anything less than that is a sop. Now, that was Dickens and his indictment of the Manchester School, the Gradgrinds, Ricardo and company, and Malthus. All of this he understands perfectly. Of course, the problem with Dickens is, as a good romantic anti-capitalist, he can't see a way into the future. All he can see is back to the world of the Pickwick Papers, Merry England, and some idealized medieval utopia, which, of course, never existed on land or sea. But now, today, what do we have? The growing movement for a minimum wage increase. And who is here to deny it? Well, the economics profession, of course. And one of its interpreters, I guess, George F. Will. Remember him? Will the Shill? We've talked about him. He was part of the machine of British influence back in the 1990s that interfered in U.S. affairs so much, right? Part of the Conrad Black publishing empire for quite a while. But now let's look at what Will talks about now. His Christmas column, or, yeah, I guess it is. His the last column, or the next to the last, before Christmas, George F. Will, How to Help the Poor. And he doesn't want to raise the minimum wage. He mocks it. He says the minimum wage is supposed to be raised for the 23rd time since 1938, from today's $7.25 to $10.10. Great idea, he says, and then he goes through if, and his ideological points then come to the fore. He doesn't want to raise the minimum wage. These are chop logic arguments. I'm not going to try to reproduce them. One person writing in to the Washington Post a little while later commented that Will is a modern-day Scrooge, and the logical conclusion from George Will's column is that the best way to help the low-wage earners would be to eliminate the hourly minimum wage altogether. Why doesn't he say that? Another guy writes in saying, this is reactionary thought or conservatism degenerating into a self-parody. 10 days before Christmas, Will tried to prove that higher wages cause poverty while lower wages bring prosperity. And once again, the distribution of the pie, there is no such thing as a metaphysically valid distribution of the pie. The distribution of the pie is whatever class struggle determines. And we're coming out of a 40-year period where the class struggle has been going the wrong way. Might it now start going the right way and alter the distribution? Possible. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Do take a look at the Russian fleets. My lecture on C-SPAN still beating quite a good rogues gallery of malefactors, pedants, and nitwits up there. But every time you go and look at it, you help my cause of trying to get it rebroadcast in the face of a historical profession, which, as I had to observe in the course of this lecture, people, because they are blinded by hatred of Russia in particular, they're willing to sacrifice historical truth on the altar of the Anglo-American special relationship, and that is not history, right? That's ideology. That's a fairy tale. It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, fellow people, I would say, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is condemned to wander the world. And Marley's ghost, where's the chain he forged in life? Imagine looking at Jamie Dimon or Blankfein or Larry Summers and look at the chain, Bob Rubin, the chain that they forged in life. Anyway, Will the Shill objects. He says, raising the minimum wage is a great idea if you think government should prevent two consenting parties, an employer and a worker, from agreeing to an hourly wage that government disapproves of. Yes, I object. The government must interfere in that. These are the arguments of Bentham. Two treatises by Bentham that I think Will has been looking at. One is called In Defense of Usury, which gives exactly this argument. And then there's, of course, In Defense of Pederasty. We won't go through that on our family program. And he's also worried that organized labor may find their hope realized, that raising the minimum wage will raise the general wage floor, thereby strengthening unions' negotiating positions. Exactly right. That's exactly what needs to happen. The pathetic weakness, the scandalous weakness of the unions needs to be remedied. Most of their abuses today grow out of their weakness, not out of their strength. And that's precisely the idea. So at any given moment, the distribution of the pie reflects the dynamics of the class struggle. People against finance oligarchs, middle class against finance oligarchs. But when you say middle class, you're talking about an entity that is capable of struggle, or at least we hope so. So the middle class against the financier class, that's the proposition. And remember, the middle class means the middle class and anybody who wants to join it, right? Anybody who wants to make common cause. The middle class and its allies. So that is the situation of the so-called economics profession here at this point in time. And in earlier editions, we have Robert J. Samuelson, another, in this case, a legacy, an oligarch, a nepotist. And you know that Robert J. Samuelson has been writing his drivel in his idiotic column for decades, primarily because his father, Paul Samuelson, taught at MIT and won the Nobel Prize for his now discredited treatise on economics, which was used as a classroom text so much in the 1960s and 70s, even though this book was better than a lot of the stuff that we have right now. And this gets us then to the Pope. The struggle between Limbaugh and the Pope has been going on this week. And by Limbaugh, of course, I mean not just Limbaugh, this individual with his Institute for Retarded Reactionary Ranting, but the larger Tea Party, that is to say Sarah Palin and any number of others of these people. They're all apoplectic that the Pope is attacking supply side, monetarism, Thatcher, and Reagan. One symbol that occurred this past week, the Pope had his birthday. He invited in 4 homeless men from the area. It's called Borgo, the part of Rome that's right next to the walls, the Leonine walls of Vatican City. These are homeless people, clochards, who are out there trying to live rough in the cold winter. So he invited them in for breakfast on his birthday. Compare this to the monster, and I say monster, Ronald Reagan. When Reagan was president, I remember this well, it was the mid-'80s, and a homeless man had frozen to death in one of the hedges of Lafayette Park. He was found in the morning. And Reagan immediately commented that those clochards, those homeless people, were living in the parks because they wanted to. That was their choice. Who can prevent them, right, from writing that kind of a contract with their own destiny? And then Reagan immediately launched into his anecdotes about the black welfare mother and other people who live like kings in the lap of luxury because they are collecting welfare from 10 different names. Compare the Pope, who invites the 4 homeless men in as a symbol close to Christmas and on his birthday morning, compared to the monster Reagan. Now, the hysteria of Limbaugh indicates that these reactionary circles, right, these people, and of course with Limbaugh it goes back to Henry Kissinger, and it goes back to William F. Buckley, his patron, the guy who got him going, right? William F. Buckley realized that his own version of reactionary economics was not going to break through with the blue-collar set, but that in order to dupe them, there had to be dimensions of cultural populism loaded on, right? Anti-elitism, anti-rich. Of course, William F. Buckley could hardly engage in that with any credibility, right? It sounds like he was a member of the British House of Lords. But Limbaugh was able to do it. They realized that the ideological climate of the world is now changing because of the Depression, because of the Pope, because of the accumulated rage and frustration of a million struggles across the world, mass strikes in many countries, and indeed Occupy. Occupy contributed something important to this by raising awareness. Although they fell short of what they could have done, they could have caused and obtained the first breakthrough in terms of policy. They could have imposed maybe not the entire Wall Street sales tax, but a significant step in that direction. I am thinking of Canossa. It's wintertime. We have, during the Middle Ages, this is January 1077, the Emperor Henry IV of the Roman Empire gets locked into a struggle with the Pope. Now, this is more than ideology, of course. This is appointments, right? This is the question of investiture. Who gets to name bishops? Who gets to install bishops? And, of course, the Holy Roman Emperor of Germany says, well, I do. I'm Henry IV, and I'm the Holy Roman Emperor, and I get to choose them. Whereas the Pope, in this case, Gregory VII, Hildebrand, one of the stronger popes of the late Middle Ages, and not necessarily a very great guy on a number of points, at a certain point, this struggle goes on, and taking advantage of the fact that Hildebrand has excommunicated the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, a lot of vassals start rebelling, and at a certain point, Henry realizes that he has bit off more than he can chew. So he decides to make a pilgrimage of penitence to Canossa, which is the palace of the Pope in Emilia-Romagna. He wears a hair shirt. He waits all night, actually for 2 days, according to some accounts, in the snow in the courtyard before he's allowed to come in and confess his sins. It means when you tangle with the Pope on these questions of ideology, you're likely to end up kneeling in the snow at Canossa. I can see Limbaugh at Canossa right now. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Now let's change gears for a minute. We've been talking about Scrooge economics and the Pope and the minimum wage and related issues. During the course of the last couple of weeks, I've come across a book, the title of which alone recommends it. This is called Presidential Puppetry. Presidential Puppetry by Andrew Craig. And it's a new book, and here's the importance of it from my point of view. The biggest fallacy, or one of the biggest and most stubborn fallacies in analyzing U.S. politics, is this assumption that presidents automatically have power, and that if something happens, the president must have made it happen. People say, well, if the battleship Maine blew up in Havana Harbor, then that must have been designed by William McKinley. And if the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, that must have been designed by Franklin D. Roosevelt. Both of those are wrong, by the way. Neither one was designed by a U.S. president. And 9/11, people say, oh, well, Bush or maybe Cheney must have designed every detail of that and run every detail. No. The whole point is that the U.S. presidency is a puppet post unless you have a president who is willing to fight to make it something else. And Franklin D. Roosevelt is the leading example of recent years, and John F. Kennedy is also one. So here we have this very interesting book by Andrew Craig, which describes, and this is Craig, K-R-E-I-G, Presidential Puppetry, Obama, Romney, and Their Masters. It's available from, from Eagle View Books in Washington, D.C. Andrew, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, but welcome. Why don't you come on? Are you there? Hello? Andrew? Hello? Maybe the control room can help me out here? No? Okay. Well, let me just, go ahead. And let me just describe what I found one of the more interesting samples of this stuff. Obama and Romney and so forth, all right, fine. But here, let's look at the part about General David Petraeus, right, in whom we're always interested because he incarnates the tendencies towards dictatorship, coup d'etat in the present situation. And here's what we find, and this was something I thought was valuable. In the fall of 2009, New York Congressman Eric Massa was approached by 4 U.S. generals, and they informed him that General David Petraeus, while serving as an active duty officer, Petraeus had met twice with former GOP Vice President Dick Cheney, and Cheney had suggested to Petraeus that Petraeus compete in a weak field for the 2012 GOP nomination to oppose Obama's re-election. And this was considered illegal and quite possibly treasonous for a commander in wartime, because a battlefield commander has a sensitive role. And Massa had worked for Wesley Clark, and he claims that Wesley Clark never did any of this. And then we have Massa then taken down by scandals, Watergated out. And maybe, Andrew, if you're with us now?
Yes, can you hear me?
Hi there. Look, I'm just going through what I thought was one of the gems in your book, which is the description of how Eric Massa lost his seat in Congress practically because he went forward exposing General David Petraeus. So maybe you take it from there.
Well, I will. It's kind of an amazing story because pretty much everybody in public life remembers Massa's takedown and vaguely thinks that there was some big scandal. But when you look at it, it really wasn't hardly anything in terms of scandal, and Massa disputes even what was there. And when one realizes with all of this surveillance, including over members of the Senate and Congress, and former NSA analyst Russell Tice has said that they even had surveillance on Obama when he was a senator, it shows not just surveillance, but reprisal and a level of control by not simply the intelligence services, but intelligence services that seem to be loyal to these elites, these outside of almost the scope of government. So I did hear your very kind introduction, Webster. Sorry, there was some glitch preventing me from talking, but I'll say that it's really terrific to be on the program because the book draws heavily from a number of your important works, and I'm glad you found something that was somewhat novel because, researchers, including myself, are deeply indebted to your cutting-edge research on a number of these topics.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Now, let's dig a little bit deeper now. I found the Petraeus one extremely intriguing. Maybe we get you to give us maybe another specific case that you've come up with, something really scandalous.
Oh,
then, let's go on then to your general findings about this question of puppetry, and above all, who the puppet masters actually are.
Well, exactly. First of all, even though these are pretty current examples, including the one I'm just about to lay on you, it goes back 100 years to kind of set the stage with the Rhodes money, creating the Council on Foreign Relations and the Rhodes Scholarships, and leading up to all of this, including secret societies. But just as a footnote on this Petraeus scandal, before I get to the next one, we have a very interesting situation where Petraeus, after being fired and disgraced, big sex scandal, he pops up at the Bilderberg Group meeting in June, and he's CEO of a hedge fund arranged by puppet masters from KKR. They've named him as one of their CEOs on Wall Street, so he gets to go to the Bilderberg meeting with David Rockefeller himself, who's still alive at age 98, and other people like Kissinger and
Henry Kravis, right? Henry Kravis is now his money bags.
Yes, exactly. And of course, Henry Kravitz's father helped create the oil depletion allowance. You know, he was a tax genius from Oklahoma.
And Kravis was, of course, a close friend of Prescott Bush and one of the sponsors of George Bush the Elder.
Yes, they go all the way back. This is dynastic power. But you ask for a fresh scandal. Here's one you probably know, but very few other people know. There was a very interesting article in the Washington Post about a month ago, and it was only 2 inches long, but it had the interesting announcement that a little company called Amazon.com had won the contract to handle the next generation cloud computing for a federal agency that goes by the name CIA. And what this means is that yet another Bilderberg Group attendee, the new owner of the Washington Post, Jeffrey Bezos, his company...
I think it's actually pronounced Bozos, as in Bozo.
Okay.
But the music is on top of us. We have one more segment of 10 minutes, and we'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is the second hour of our Christmas week broadcast, and I'm here from Washington, D.C. We're talking also in Washington, D.C. Andrew Craig, that's Kreig. The book is called Presidential Puppetry, Obama, Romney, and Their Masters. And Andrew was just telling us about Jeff Bezos and Amazon.com. Not content with taking over the Washington Post, they're also taking over cloud computing for the CIA.
Yes, and they had a 2-inch story about it, exploring the ramifications, I'm sure. But it just covers their butt, so to speak. They can say, oh, we covered that. But think of the implications of a company that's got this vast consumer database of everything that we buy. It's a fine company. I mean, they do excellent consumer service and so forth. But think of what it means if they also control still the most influential news organization in Washington. And the CIA's, they're seeking CIA business and, in fact, have obtained it. And they would probably say, well, they're all in separate little categories and there's no problem for the public. I don't believe that there's no potential problem. And actual problems, I can easily visualize that. It's all fairly new, but that's the kind of thing that the book explores, and the public really needs to be concerned about. Here's another one, and I'll be very brief, but just to toss something else out. I explore in the book election machines and how they are capable of being manipulated to adjust election results, and in fact have been. And I get into not only who's doing it and how, but here's a couple of other implications. Somebody owns these private companies, and I trace it back to there's Bush family investment in this. And they don't need to affect every machine. In fact, the problems tend to arise when the votes are accumulated, and so it's done in a way that the nice older volunteers at the polls are never going to know about. And so elections look like they're just normally and honestly run, but there's a huge potential for manipulating the results, as in 2004, and I document that there was an attempt made in Ohio last year, and the news media just does not want to get into this for various reasons that I could explore, but part of it has to do with they're making a lot of money on election ads, and if the public started thinking that all of this years of campaigning, all of these punditry and all of that stuff can be manipulated in some districts in Ohio, people would be very upset. So, and then finally, we're exporting this technology to third world countries or overseas countries, and some of them do not necessarily want advanced voting machine software, particularly controlled by backers of the Bush family, let's say,
sure,
determining their elections. And we make it look like these ungrateful countries, some of whom are in Eastern Europe or elsewhere, just don't like democracy because they don't like these NGOs and others who are touting this kind of election software, but maybe they know something that the American public should know.
I think they do. For Ohio, we had Bob Fitrakis come on here. He was one of the guys leading that attempt to expose that in Ohio. And now, Andrew, now that you've got your book out and you're going to sell a lot of copies, you're going to see what a ripoff that Bezos is, because you're going to see that Amazon fixes the transactions so that they rake off most of the profit, leaving very little for us poor authors, of which number you are now one. But now, the big question, some idea of the puppet masters, how you see them, maybe the control mechanisms, and even some idea of how to put an end to this system.
Well, that's a very important part, because first comes knowledge of what the ordinary person in this country and elsewhere is up against. And we can't just relax and leave things to government and think that a vote every 4 years is going to solve the problems, because all of these people are responsive to the puppet masters much more so than us. So we've got to know the secrets. But we also have to take some action. You've got an important program to organize around the notions of austerity, the needless austerity that the puppet masters are imposing. But there are additional things that people can and must do, really, to protect our futures, each one of us. And my suggestion, after being here in Washington as an attorney and advocate for a couple decades now, is that individuals do not matter to certainly puppet masters, but even to their minions in government. They're going to pretend that they care about individuals and individual complaints, but it's really almost a waste of time. The main solution I see is to pick organizations and leaders that you care about, get active in organizations, and adjust their agendas for these kind of reform topics. And organizations can be civic, community, based in a region, or professional, or school alumni groups, but get them focused on serious issues and volunteer to create events and be involved in publicity, because ultimately it's organizations, either new or existing ones, that are going to have the clout to achieve the reform goals that are quite serious and necessary right now.
Okay, and you're actually doing some of these things. The Justice Integrity Project, which is online, Justice Integrity Project, and the McClendon Group, right?
Which is a speakers society based at the National Press Club that brings in eminent alternative speakers, including yourself recently, but Ralph Nader, Helen Thomas, often people who, dare I say it, have fallen out of favor with the kind of corporate media and are basically the corporate media gets squeamish about inviting those truth tellers who might antagonize the minions of the puppet masters.
And we just had Mother Agnes Mariam of Syria, right, in the face of a new attempt to start a war in Syria. This was extremely timely, and that was part of, you were certainly an important part of that.
That's exactly what the kind of thing we're talking about, just briefly. So someone invites Mother Agnes, she gives a talk, and then we're able to write about it and get this important alternative view out in a way that the corporate media, which is just banging the drum for more and more war and suffering over there, it makes it a little easier for them to cover it, although most of them still won't.
Correct. So the book is Presidential Puppetry, Obama, Romney, and Their Masters, Andrew Craig, Kreig. Andrew, do they have to go to Amazon, or can they get it direct from a publisher, and that way you get a better deal?
They can go to the Presidential Puppetry site, but it's easier to go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or even ask a bookstore. A final thing, I'd love to give talks to any group of virtually any size, so I'd love to talk to a group.
Webster Tarpley back again here on World Crisis Radio. So Presidential Puppetry by Andrew Craig, Kreig. If you're interested in having him give a talk, you can go to the Presidential Puppetry website, or alternatively send me an email and I can forward it to him. And of course, as far as that activism goes, we recommend also United Front Against Austerity and Tax Wall Street Party. We can be, I think, rather specific in the goals. All right, now we want to continue with something that we've already started. 2014, even more than 2013, we hope is going to be the year in which more voices and more choices emerge. That is to say, a greater variety in the political landscape or in the political palette. And that includes not just Republicans, Democrats, Tea Party, and a few others, but the Tax Wall Street Party. And once again, we're happy to have the world's leading expert in precisely this issue, and that is the former presidential candidate in 2012, Darcy Richardson. Are you with us, Darcy?
Hi, Webster. How are you? And
great.
Greetings to all of your listeners.
We have 20 minutes, and why don't you take it any way you want? Linking back to what we discussed, about a month ago, but also looking forward now, so that we begin this thought process that eventually we hope will lead to many candidacies and indeed a new party in 2014.
Right. In the last segment back in November, we were talking about the Populist Party, and which existed in the 1890s, which had a clear set of economic demands, and probably most closely resembles what the Tax Wall Street Party is trying to do. It was in fact anti-Wall Street and had a solid program of economic reforms. Those reforms initially came out of the Ocala demands, which were made by the National Farmers Alliance, and that was held here in Florida in 1890, and eventually written into the party's platform at the party's famous founding convention in Omaha.
Right.
A lot of the things the populists pushed for later sprouted during the New Deal.
Exactly.
The party's original platform called for the enactment of a radical sub-treasury plan, which would have revolutionized credit and marketing arrangements for crops. Of course, the most famous plank in the platform is probably the free and unlimited coinage of silver and gold at a ratio of 16-1. But they also advocated government ownership of the railroads, telephone and telegraph systems, a graduated income tax. The country didn't have an income tax at that time. Also the adoption of an Australian secret ballot, and then, of course, the creation of postal savings banks, an 8-hour workday, and something that progressives later picked up as well was the adoption of the initiative and a referendum. But the populists, interestingly, they were the immediate successor to the Greenback or Greenback Labor Party, which had existed in the 1870s. And the Greenback Party had, at one point in 1878, elected 14 congressmen, which was phenomenal for a third party. One of them was Adlai Stevenson's grandfather, who was elected from Illinois. But the Populist Party really had these economic demands, and it actually took hold, particularly in the Midwest and in the South. The party elected 4 governors in the 1890s, including Bloody Bridles Wade of Colorado. He was elected in 1892. Kansas, they elected successive governors, Lorenzo Llewellyn and John Leedy, and then the state of South Dakota in 1896. The year William Jennings Bryan ran on a fusion ticket, Democratic and Populist Party fusion ticket. Andrew Lee was elected governor there. And then they also had the related Silver Party in Nevada, which the Silver Party's state platform mirrored the Populist Party platform, and they elected two governors as well. So the Populist Party showed that a new party competing against the Democrats and Republicans could be successful at the ballot box. They elected 22 congressmen and 5 U.S. senators in 1896, and literally hundreds of state legislators all across the country, including in the solid South, the one-party South. In Georgia, believe it or not, they elected 47 state House members and 5 state senators. And even before that, before 1896, which was really the party's high water mark, they had elected 8 congressmen in 1890, 2 U.S. senators. 2 years later, they elected 11 congressmen and 4 senators. And even as late as 1900, they still claimed 5 House members and 2 U.S. senators, one, I believe, from Kansas and one from Nebraska. So the party really started to push the Democrats and the Republicans in the direction of adopting some of these economic reforms that they were advocating. And, of course, the party throughout its history, 1892 all the way up to 1908, always fielded a presidential candidate. In 1892, the party nominated former Union Army General James Weaver of Iowa. He carried 5 states in the 1892 presidential election, Colorado, Idaho, Kansas, Nevada, and North Dakota. So he won 22 of the, at the time we had 444 electoral votes nationally. So that was really astounding for a new party. And Weaver, of course, had previously, a dozen years before that, in 1880, he had been the Greenback Labor Party candidate for president and campaigned with the famous Mary Lease of Kansas. And Lease, who's never at a loss for words, said at the time that she and Weaver looked like walking omelets because every time they spoke in the South, they would have all these eggs tossed at them. So it wasn't easy on the campaign trail for them, but the voters responded, and the two parties noticed that. And, of course, after Bryan's candidacy in 1896, the party had, fused with the Democrats that year, and a lot of the purists in the Populist Party were actually opposed to any kind of fusion with the Democrats, whom they believe was still, the Democratic Party was still controlled by Wall Street. So the fusionists broke off, and in 1900, they nominated somebody near and dear to your heart, Webster, Philadelphia financier Wharton Barker. And, of course, Barker was a noted expert on Far East affairs, and he had single-handedly itself. But anyway,
let me just point out in these years, right? August Belmont was pretty much the owner of the Democratic Party, kind of like Soros.
Exactly.
Today, but now that's our break. But the question I want to ask you is, what was the limit? In other words, what was it that prevented this group from being a rural party to being a industrial worker party? Back in a second on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So as a part of our continuing coverage, which is going to be one of our great themes of 2014, we're going to be going to Darcy Richardson as again, the world's leading expert in precisely this topic. Let me just ask the question, right? What was it, as far as you can see, that prevented the Populist Party from going beyond this sort of farm, Western, silver, and Southern center of gravity? What was it that prevented them from breaking into the great industrial areas of the Midwest and in particular the Northeast, right? What was it that stopped them? Were there organizations in their way, or what was it?
Well, they did. That's a great question, Webster. They did have some people in the labor movement, like Terence Powderly, who was very sympathetic. He was with the Knights of Labor, which at that point was the strongest national union in the country. He was very sympathetic. He tried. He was based in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He tried to promote the Populist Party in Pennsylvania. The problem was that the party, and I think it had to do more with, their stronghold was Nebraska, and plus they had Tom Watson in the Deep South in Georgia. But because the party was so agrarian based, I don't think they really, and this was a fatal flaw in the party, I don't think they really tried to organize in a lot of the urban areas, particularly in the Northeast. There were some attempts made, but they really didn't make any serious headway, and that prevented the party from being truly a national party.
Which I think that's an important lesson for us now, right? That you've got to be inclusive.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I think I've seen in some research about this is that it allowed the Democrats or Republicans, depending on who controlled the machine, right? Because remember, the Philadelphia machine was Republican. They could say, "Oh, watch out for those guys. If you're an industrial worker, they want to devalue your paycheck, your pay envelope, because they want inflation." And that's not going to help you. You're going to be able to buy less with what you get. So I don't think they ever found an answer.
Right, and there were a lot of threats made, particularly in the 1896 period, where blue-collar workers were threatened with their livelihoods if they voted for the Populist Party. That's something that also, happened to the Socialist Party. A few years after that, people were threatened with their livelihoods if they supported these folks out of what they would describe out of the Twilight Zone. These are radicals, and our business is going to downsize. We're going to go out of business if you support them. So there were all kinds of threats being made too by employers. So it's a great point, and that is an important lesson for the Tax Wall Street Party and any party trying to organize, on a national level today. You need, as decimated as organized labor is today, you need labor to be a key part of this.
And indeed, all relevant groups, right, whatever they are, if they're there, you got to organize them. Because if you don't organize them, the class enemy, will organize them against you. The other thing about the populists that I've always noticed is, in the literature, when you look at somebody like Hofstadter and his paranoid style, this is the original target, right? The populists are the target of this stuff about paranoid conspiracy theory, because they had a fairly good idea of how the central banks were controlled, in particular from London, and the influence of various European banking families and so forth. And then they were considered, to be, again, paranoid, the ruling class, Wall Street, has tended to respond to newer movements more or less according to the way they responded to the original populists.
Great point. And even in later years, when after the turn of the century, the party turned to former Congressman Tom Watson of Georgia and nominated him for president in 1904. Of course, Watson didn't have a lot of appeal in any of the urban areas in the country, particularly in New England and the Northeast.
Right.
But he campaigned vigorously. He actually reached out to William Jennings Bryan and asked him to endorse him. But Bryan was under so much pressure from his party. He had been, the nominee in 1896 and 1900, and then 4 years later, in 1908, he was nominated again. But in the 1904 campaign, Bryan had denounced the Democratic nominee, Alton Parker, who was a corporate Wall Street lawyer, as the muzzled candidate of Wall Street. So Watson felt that Bryan might come out for him. Had that happened, then the party probably would have survived beyond the early 1900s. You'd have this major figure, William Jennings Bryan, who's beloved by millions across the country. But he was under pressure from his party and stayed silent. He didn't actively campaign or endorse Watson, and that was another thing that led to the party's downfall. So yeah, it's very important. Reach out to the urban areas and organize labor, and like you said, any group that has some clout, has to be a part of any kind of movement to challenge the duopoly. And
people have to remember one of the main things you got to bear in mind is that from 1828 to 1932, that's 100 years. The Democrats are the bad guys, generally speaking, right?
Yeah,
they're the white supremacists and the racists and Confederates and everything else.
Right. Good point. And one of the things that the populists, the thing I think you would find interesting, and you probably already know this, but you have Henry Carey from Philadelphia in the 1850s through almost, I guess he lived about 1879. A big advocate of the American system. Well, interestingly, Carey, toward the end of his life, he joined the Greenback Party. And had he lived longer, he probably would have ended up as a populist. And so I thought that's pretty interesting that you had folks, who went into the Greenback Party and later the Populist Party who were actually advocates of the American system. So that's another thing that is kind of overlooked by most historians. The kind of the American system legacy, where it went, after Lincoln's death.
And we have to remember the original populist is Plato, right? And this is there's no doubt about it. Now, Darcy, looking ahead in the coming weeks, right? Most likely in the next installment or otherwise soon in January. Where are you going to be taking us, right? What are the other moments of this cavalcade that are highly relevant?
Well, we can look at Teddy Roosevelt's Progressive Party in 1912, which I don't consider it anything close to what the Populist Party movement was, but that was kind of the defining third party for the period right before World War I. But also there are some lessons to be learned, I think, from the Socialist Party of Eugene Debs during that period. Debs, before the Socialist Party was founded, Debs was a member of the Populist Party, and so a lot of the folks, when the Populist Party faded from the scene, went into the Socialist Party or later into the Farmer Labor Party.
Okay, we'll look forward to that. I just with Teddy Roosevelt, the Bull Moose Party, that's Morgan, right? That's exactly. A bunch of Morgan partners who they're not happy with Taft. They want to bring in Woodrow Wilson, so they use Teddy Roosevelt to split the Republicans and bring on Woodrow. Okay, we'll see you probably next week then.
Okay,
Thank you very much, Darcy. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, the final segment of our Christmas week broadcast. So we have explored the connections, the deep ideological similarity of Will the Shill with Scrooge, and we're not going to forget little Rand Paul, who came out saying that it would be a terrible disservice to the unemployed to extend those benefits beyond 26 weeks because, gosh, if an employer sees that you've been out of work for more than 26 weeks, well, then he's not going to hire you, is he? Well, maybe not in the current monstrous economic configuration, but the time may be coming, if we could get a recovery going and a boom, when employers would be begging such people to bring the benefits of their experience to bear on the work at hand. So little Rand, as was already, I think, proposed by a couple of columnists, little Rand qualifies as a Scrooge, a Gradgrind. Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? That seems to be little Rand's approach. And, of course, he's following in the footsteps of the original Paul Tard. But now, couple of important notes on the questions of war and peace, because we're talking about the Prince of Peace, right? Many columnists don't seem to understand this. First of all, in Kiev, we've got the meddlers. We've got John McCain. You can see a very interesting meme that's circulating on the Internet. It's got a bunch of these poor Ukrainian dupes, or maybe fascists or neo-Nazis in the Svoboda Party, and they're out there. Seemingly their agenda is that their daughter should become a cleaning woman in London, or that multinational corporations and Goldman Sachs should buy up that rich Ukrainian black earth farmland. Remember, Ukraine is a breadbasket. People who want to take over the Ukraine maybe want to do it for reasons of food control, to try to starve out certain others. This must not be allowed to happen. And then, of course, John McCain, scorned and reviled here most deservedly because of his warmonger tendencies. You can see this guy has never seen a war that he didn't want to start. He's up there thinking, as he's lionized by the crowd in Maidan, Independence Square, gosh, if Americans were this gullible, I could have been president. But it was not to be. Putin, as a statesman, has now intervened. $15 billion Russian loan and purchases of Ukrainian bonds. There will be no state bankruptcy, and the price of natural gas goes down from $400 to $268. That was always available. If you want a political price, then give political concessions. It's easy. It's called political economy. So we're hoping that General Winter, Field Marshal Winter, should now do his work and let Moros, right, the Frost, with his red nose, come and invite these hapless protesters out of the square. And their poor leader, this Klitschko, we're thinking about the poor guys in the National Football League with all those concussions, and even baseball players with concussions. What are we to make of poor Klitschko? He should go and seek treatment. His most recent statement seemed to be challenging Yanukovych to go and have a prize fight in the ring. What a lamentable method of arguing, the absolute nadir. And now Syria, right? Last week, as we've pointed out, and with help from many of our listeners and from Andrew Craig that you've just heard from at the McClendon Group, we had Mother Agnes Mariam at the National Press Club, at the State Department, in Congress, and elsewhere. And now we've got, somehow, in concomitance with the Christmas holiday, we've got a new campaign, this time trying to start once again from the humanitarian emergency as winter now begins to come on with its full wrath. Just looking at the Washington Post of the last a couple of days, here we've got the Washington Post on Sunday, December 15th. The Syrian abyss. The United States stands by as a dictator starves his people. We're watching innocents die, says the Washington Post. Oh, of course, their deep humanitarian commitment, we know, from the Graham family to Bezos or Bozos or whatever his name is. That was on the 15th of December. On the 16th of December, Fred Hyatt, one of the editors of the editorial page, letting Syrians starve. And here the hypocrisy gets very dense. No one wants to send U.S. troops to Syria. That's what they tell you now. Just advisors, I guess, or spotters. No one contemplated sending U.S. troops to Syria. But Susan Rice, when she was talking about Sudan, Darfur, 10 years ago, military action might entail airdrops, a no-fly zone to protect civilians from government bombing, the establishment of humanitarian safe zones, and security for critical deliveries by rail and road. I'm sorry, a no-fly zone is a comprehensive bombing campaign with tens of thousands of deaths. I'm sorry. These are hypocrites. Starve. 50,000 people a day starve in this world, Fred Hyatt and Washington Post editorial board. Why do you get so worked up over this particular example when your cold indifference to all the rest could hardly have been more complete? And now we have today, as we're recording on December 18th, Wednesday, a day in Syria. U.S. inaction in the war-torn country could prove costlier than intervention. And they've got this campaign going about the barrel bombs. I suspect this will turn out to be a new Kuwait incubator babies, a new Jessica Lynch, a new Neda, or whatever it is. Syrian government helicopters on Monday dropped barrel bombs on residential neighborhoods in Aleppo, packed with screws, scrap metal, old car parts, blades, and explosives, says the Wall Street Journal. Oh, that other humanitarian organ, always alert for any violation of human rights, especially economic rights, all over the world. So you get the picture. There is a campaign, and I think it has to do with the fact that we're looking not even at the last throes, but quite possibly the death rattle of the terrorist insurgency. All that money put in by Saudi Arabia, all that money put in by Qatar and the Emirates and the rest of them, and all that effort from the CIA. And now the warehouses have come under control of the recalcitrant terrorists, right, the Al-Qaeda types. And will they start shooting down airliners? Well, you get the picture. Aleppo, it seems to me, is approaching liberation. When? I don't know, but it's perfectly feasible. And the big challenge now during the Christmas holidays and New Year's and the other holidays that come is to maintain vigilance on this important question. Hands off Syria. Nobody but nobody in the U.S. regime or in the U.S. media has any humanitarian credibility on a place like Syria after they cheer-led the destruction of Libya as a functioning modern country. That is their goal for Syria. It is mass murder. Don't believe their stories. The State Department and the Washington Post are hardly concerned about starving children in refugee camps in Turkey or in Jordan. They're looking for excuses, pretexts to start a wider war, and it must not happen. And there's a soft line on this stuff. David Ignatius pioneers the soft line that he takes up Walter Russell Mead, The End of History Ends, and all of the sophisticated people in the Middle East are horrified by, does the U.S. understand that its credibility has collapsed in this part of the world, says a well-connected Arab who speaks with the region's leaders? Well, if you mean the militarized foreign policy, that had to end sooner or later, so it might as well end right now, and we're happy to be going into the Christmas holiday with no war in Syria, no war in Iran, and any politician or even media hack, press whore or hound who tries to change that by introducing war will find themselves swept away in 2014. Wage. And what this means, of course, is that any political economy in any given stage of its development demonstrates a certain distribution. And that distribution is the result of the political forces, of class struggle, and at any time. And the question is, which way will it be altered? And we'll be back in a minute to comment on how it ought to be altered in 2014 here on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. And I wonder when we get to the point where the Wall Street finance oligarchs, the predators, the parasites, throw down their derivatives and say, business, mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. And it is this time in the rolling year, I would have said the rolling fiscal year, that this suffering is the most acute for Marley's ghost, chained to those old ledgers and safes and strong boxes. And today, of course, it would be electronic with derivatives, collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps, and other derivative exotic securities. All right. So this is the question of economics. There is no more corrupt discipline than academic economics. And, of course, we've had Helicopter Ben Bernanke, who has perverted the Federal Reserve, right? He's supposed to provide full employment as well as currency price stability. He has totally failed to provide full employment under the Humphrey-Hawkins Act. He's in insurrection against the Humphrey-Hawkins Act, and he should have been impeached before he's leaving. Yellen is absolute sociopath. But that is what Dickens is horrified by, and you can see this in books like Hard Times, where he attacks what he calls the Gradgrind school of economics. Right? The Gradgrind is, we want the facts, we want the facts. But out of this grows Malthus, and out of Malthus grows Darwin, and out of Darwin, the biological charlatan, we get the charlatan doctrine of social Darwinism. And that is the famous scene at the beginning of Dickens' Christmas Carol, where the two liberal financiers come in and talk to Scrooge and tell him that they're taking up a collection for the poor. And Scrooge, of course, answers in his famous way, are there no prisons? And the union workhouses, are they still in operation? The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor then? Said Scrooge. Under the poor law, husbands and wives were separated, families were broken apart to prevent the birth of any more children. And once you got into this, it was just about impossible to get out of it. I was afraid from what you had said at first that something had occurred to stop these institutions in their useful course, said Scrooge. But of course, these are horrible institutions. And the two gentlemen comment that many can't go there, and many would rather die. Many people would die to keep their families together. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. And that's Malthus. That's Darwin. And that's also Keynes, because Keynes is also acknowledged by himself as being a successor to Malthus. Now, in our time, what do we have? Previous broadcasts, we've covered the growing momentum to raise the minimum. It's not the case that there's a world of spirit where things can be good and a world of material where everything is automatically bad. And when I say Manichaeans, this gets us, unfortunately, uncomfortably close to Martin Luther. And now that we're going into 2014, we've got to remember that the 500th anniversary of Luther, at least of nailing the theses to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral, that's Halloween 1517. So we're now approaching the 500th anniversary of Protestantism, and unfortunately the net impact of Protestantism is to move Christianity a bit in the direction of that Manichaean outlook. But fortunately, not all the way, and maybe this influence is less now than it might have been at different times in the past. At any rate, it's better if God is willing to come into the world for the sake, at least, of those of us who are in the material world and happen to or plan to stay here for a little while longer at least. It means that the material universe is not metaphysically, radically evil. It is at least susceptible to something other than total evil. So therefore, this on the whole is a worthwhile holiday, despite all of the distortions. Now let's look in particular at the world of economics and its relation to the doctrine of charity, right? Faith, hope, and charity, these three, and the greatest is charity. And we can say, when you're talking about the general welfare, you're talking about something that looks very, very much like charity. When you're talking about charity, you're talking about something that looks very much like Muslim social solidarity. There's a similar doctrine in Judaism, and we have Confucian benevolence. And these are the values that need to be pushed forward at this time of year. And it's always good to remember that old romantic anti-capitalist, Charles Dickens, who has contributed so much to the cultural atmosphere of the holiday. And these works of Dickens, if properly read, they do have a meaning. Remember that Dickens was horrified by the British School of Economics, and with good reason. In particular, you'll remember David Ricardo and others, and the profession of many of these British economists, of what was called the iron law of wages, which simply meant that you're in a market situation, liberismo selvaggio, a wild free market, and that in that free market, if the working class got paid more, they would multiply, there would become more of them. That would then, by the law of supply and demand, drive down the rate of wages. That would cause famine and death, and then the cycle would begin anew. When the numbers of the working class had shrunk to a suitable level, then the law of supply and demand would kick in, and the real wages would presumably start to go up again. That's the iron law of wages. That is why the Manchester School of British Classical Economics, with Ricardo, with James Mill, with John Stuart Mill, with a number of others, Jevons later on, that's why this was known as the dismal science. The dismal science, because it taught that there was no way to improve the human condition. In other words, if you do somebody a favor and give them a wage increase, well, then there'll be more workers. That will drive down wages in some future time, and the cycle of genocide will go on. That's the essence of British classical economics. And there never was a good phase. Don't let any Marxist tell you that Ricardo was somehow better than what came after. Absolutely not. He was an... Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C., and this is the penultimate broadcast of the old year 2013. It's our Christmas week edition. And remember, the significance of Christmas is an important one, theologically and philosophically. If you compare Christianity to the Nirvana religions. You recall that in the Nirvana religions of the East, the big concern is how to get out of the material universe. And this always implies a certain, what can we say, nonchalance about the fate of those who are going to remain behind in the material universe. Whereas, from that point of view, some people would say, well, God coming into the world was a terrible mistake. You might have seen on cable television a couple of years ago an attempt to rehabilitate Judas Iscariot precisely from this point of view, saying that Judas Iscariot was actually a benefactor because Christ had made this terrible mistake of coming into the world, and then Judas was the guy who helped him get out of the world and correct the mistake, although in the horrible way that was seen then on the hill of Calvary. But the idea then is that if God is willing to come into the world and be a part of the material world, that means the material world is not that bad. At least it's not absolutely evil. It might be improved. It might be perfectible. And that, I think, is the very important philosophical significance of this holiday. It means that the Manichaeans are wrong.